Hello and welcome everyone to the first session of this Introduction to Design Thinking course. I'm pleased to see so many of you logged on from around Europe and making good use of this time in isolation. I sincerely hope you're all keeping well and upbeat in this rather strange time. Now, this one-week Introduction to Design Thinking is just that. It's an introduction. You're not expected to master all of the concepts and principles discussed during these 5 days. The course objective is to provide you with a comprehensive grasp of the core design thinking principles, so that you can decide whether to focus your attention on deeper learning and application of this powerful methodology. I certainly hope you will. You will likely have heard the term design thinking before, especially in recent years as the methodology has steadily gained recognition and traction, both in academic circles and in the corporate world. Design thinking success comes with a fair share of critique as well, as one would expect when a methodology or a practice becomes widely popular. Now, we shall not shy away from investigating some of these critiques, most of which I believe are based on a misconception of what design thinking really is. So, on that note, let us start with addressing that very subject, but from the perspective of what design thinking isn't. See, if you Google design thinking and pull up the image results, which you can try, you will typically see the methodology presented as some kind of linear process, like this, with clearly defined steps from 1 to 5 usually, sometimes from 1 to 8 or variations thereof, at the end of which those steps you should have, without fault, a winning, viable, scalable and profitable product or service. Now, one of the misconceptions about design thinking is that any team can just use this methodology to create a successful product, so long as they loyally follow each step in the design thinking process to the letter. But design thinking isn't a script or an algorithm that you can run like a computer program where every output can be reliably predicted so long as the input is known and applied rigidly. See, design thinking is above all else, it's a mindset, right? It's a mental framework for excellence in creative problem solving. Creativity can't really be codified in a series of rigid steps, but what we can do, and what design thinking really is all about, is to deconstruct some of the internal processes that creative minds and teams typically use to drive successful outcomes. While this doesn't guarantee success, it does allow those with, let's say, a slightly less developed creative instinct to emulate and apply some of the capabilities that typically come natural to designers. And that really is the purpose of design thinking, is helping you to adopt a mental framework typically seen in designers for the purpose of enabling you to discover creative solutions to challenges in a way that you typically wouldn't have considered without design thinking. So if a linear representation like this of design thinking isn't faithful to the methodology, then what could replace it? Because it's nice to be able to visualize a new concept, right? So that you can really imprint it and understand it. Well, I mean, I've spent the past 20 years or so thinking about this a lot. And, a number of years ago, as I was sort of sketching and trying to visualize this, I came up with a visualization that I believe reveals the essence of design thinking quite well. Though, of course, you may very well come up with your own internal representation, and that's great because that's part of design thinking, of the creative process. So here's what I believe design thinking looks like that. It's a pentagram inside a pentagon, 5 corners, with each of the corners of the pentagon representing the 5 stages of the design thinking process: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Now, of course, we will dissect and discuss each of these stages in detail during the course, but for now I want to focus on the larger picture first, on the bird's eye perspective of design thinking. Now, why do I think that this representation of design thinking is more accurate and suitable? Well, because as you can clearly see, this schematic implies a non-linear process, where each of the core stages, the 5 corners in this case, is at every point in time connected to each other stage in the process. For example, just because we start prototyping a product or a service, it doesn't mean we stop empathizing with our audience and working on that side of the pentagon. Even when we test and release a finished product onto the market, we don't stop experimenting and ideating. Right? Think, for example, of the iPhone. If design thinking were a linear process with a defined beginning and a middle and an end, then Apple would have been done with this product upon release of the very first version, the iPhone 1. Right? I mean, gone through all the stages, it's done now, we've built it, so let's move on to a new product and leave the iPhone at that, version 1 in perpetuity. Of course not. We all know the process didn't end when they released the first iPhone. Apple continued to survey users to try and understand further needs and new needs and latent needs, needs that the users didn't even know that they had, and they didn't stop empathizing after the iPhone 1 came out. Apple continued to ideate and experiment with new features and new ideas, some of which were obviously discarded, as it goes in the process, but many of which ended up being adopted in later versions of the iPhone. And of course, as we know, we're at the time of having this conversation with you, we're at the iPhone 13, all because Apple's design process never really ends, which each aspect of the design process continually influencing each other in perpetuity, like this pentagon here, the corners of this pentagon. And this is how products and services continue to improve over time, right? Rarely reaching a final version, unless of course they reach finality because the product doesn't sell anymore, but that probably implies a major technological advance, or simply that they haven't really continued to invent and ideate and create new features. Why? Because the needs of a product or a service, they evolve as users and the world around us evolves with them. So that was just to give you an idea of what that visualization could look like, what design thinking visualized could look like. I hope that helps you situate it a little bit. I hope also that you're excited and ready to deep dive into the world of design thinking with an open mind and a willingness to upgrade your internal software. It will benefit your life in general, and I have no doubt you'll find the integration of design thinking into your career deeply beneficial. So see you on the next session where we unpack the empathy stage and look at some fascinating real-world examples, followed by a team assignment to practice all these learnings in the real world. So until next week, thank you very much and keep design thinking.